and use the hashtag #@WomenInPolicy. A network reception will follow the panel, so we hope you'll stay and join us and meet some people. Transatlantic relations is something that is near and dear to me and something that I've worked on for about 30 years. And frankly, I'm a bit dismayed and distressed at some of the deterioration that we're facing today since the highs of the Prague Summit of 2002. So I'm very pleased that we have these three wonderful women here to talk about it. And what I'd like to do is just introduce you briefly, and then I'll ask each a question, and then we're going to try to open up to the audience as soon as possible. So you've got the full biographies. We've got Julie Smith, Christine Wormuth, and Kristen Silverberg. So a couple issues. This is on the record. We're webcasting it. So speak loudly when you ask the question. So Julie, can I ask you first?
Sure.
Okay. As we all watched, President Trump hesitated early on in his tenure on the unequivocal support for Article 5 and the NATO treaty. Some weeks later, in a press conference, he did seem to endorse it. But have we really backtracked on NATO? Are we going to see something big at the summit in July? Will there be something bold, and do you think Macedonia might get an invitation?
Well, that's more than one question. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting us all here today. It's such a treat to see such a terrific audience, and always love diving into transatlantic relations. On the NATO front, you're right. I think we got off to a rocky start last year, and I think it started not just in the early part of 2017, but it really started during the campaign when they heard then candidate Donald Trump mentioned in a New York Times interview in the summer of 2016 the possibility of making U.S. commitments to Article 5 contingent on the degree to which you're meeting your defense spending targets. So there was this open-ended question about how allies that were not meeting the 2% of GDP target, how they would be treated by this administration. And so allies were anxious in that first summit that took place in 17 in the spring to hear from President Donald Trump kind of an unwavering U.S. commitment to Article 5 and to NATO as an institution. They didn't quite get that, and many of them left that meeting feeling a little uncertain. They heard all the right things from members of his cabinet. Vice President Pence did extensive travel quite early in 17 and throughout 17 to various corners of Europe, reassuring our allies in Central and Eastern Europe, in Georgia, in the Western Balkans, a number of very important visits. They heard similarly reassuring remarks from Secretary Mattis and also to a certain degree from Secretary Tillerson. But there's always been this open-ended question about what Donald Trump himself thinks about the NATO alliance. Now, as you noted, they did get a firm statement some weeks after the NATO summit last year, or the mini summit, whatever you want to call it. But they've since heard him in some of these campaign rallies say some disparaging remarks about the NATO alliance. And so as we march towards this administration's second NATO summit, which will be on July 11th and 12th in Brussels, there's still kind of an open-ended question about what the vision is for this alliance stemming from Washington. And I think while certain proposals have been put on the table, you're going to see announcements made on command structure reform, on mobility, on readiness, an emphasis on the NATO-EU relationship, and projecting stability to NATO's south. There's still, at this juncture in January, last day of January, in 2018, this open-ended question about whether or not this administration wants to really be in a leadership role inside the NATO alliance. And so I guess I can't answer with certainty whether or not we're going to see those bold, innovative ideas. I don't know what will happen with Macedonia. Obviously, the recent talks that were taking place were encouraging, but we didn't quite cross the finish line on resolving the name issue. I think there are folks on both sides of the Atlantic that would very much like to see that happen and bring them into the NATO family. Whether or not we can get there, I don't know. History shows us that this is one tough nut to crack. But the only good news I'll relay is that the people that are coming into this administration, like Wes Mitchell, who's now the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Russia, Wes is in a great position to provide some of those fresh ideas in advance of the NATO summit. He can work with some of the good colleagues he has across the interagency. And I hope that we will see in the coming weeks and months a US government that's energized and committed to this alliance so that we can make the summer summit a success.
In a word, what would you describe your emotions toward this?
I have some anxiety. I mean, I think my own views are reflective of some on the other side of the Atlantic, because I feel like the one message the allies get over and over and over in every bilateral meeting is defense spending. And actually, I think thanks to Putin and in part to Donald Trump, the defense spending is on the rise across Europe. It's not going to change overnight, but the trends are moving in the right direction. The next question the administration should be asking, though, is how do you want to spend those added resources? And I'm not seeing a lot of fresh thinking in that regard. It seems to be the drumbeat of spend more, spend more, spend more. But assuming that's going to happen, I mean, at one point in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to have a significant fresh input or insertion of resources into the NATO alliance from these increases that we're seeing. And we should think strategically about how to make investments that will have the greatest impact on NATO's wider security.
Great, thank you. Christine, although relations between President Trump and some European leaders, most notably May and Merkel, seem strained, Trump's enthusiasm for NATO and EU appears to be tepid, as you discussed. But what do you think is beneath the tweets and the rhetoric? Is there more continuity in the defense alliance? What do you predict?
You know, I think it is important to look past the tweets, and this is something that I say to a lot of delegations coming in from Europe, because when you do look past the tweets and when you do look past some of the speeches he gives that are a lot like campaign rallies, there is a lot of continuity there in terms of actions on the ground. I mean, you've seen in the 2018 defense budget, for example, we increased the amount of funding that went to the European Deterrence Initiative, and I expect that the FY 2019 budget that's going to come out probably in the next couple of weeks will add yet more to that. And if you look at, you know, we're continuing to put the rotational deployments into Europe. We are continuing to do the exercises and the training that's supported by the European Defense Initiative. So I think there's a lot of good continuity there, and I think, you know, there's, particularly with the publication of the National Security Strategy and the new National Defense Strategy, there's a real emphasis on Russia and China, but in this context of this conversation, Russia as a strategic competitor. And I think there are lots of indications that the United States and the US military in particular are going to continue, and if anything, double down on making the kinds of investments in capabilities that are needed to strengthen our deterrent, to reduce the vulnerability of the overall NATO footprint in Europe. So there's a lot of, I think, goodness there. At the same time, at the end of the day, and I think, you know, a year into this new administration is an appropriate time to sort of step back and reflect. What the head of, you know, what the commander-in-chief, what the head of state, what the president of the United States says about any given major policy issue matters. And I think it is hard to ask our allies and partners around the world, but particularly in Europe, to look entirely past what the president is saying. And while I think that people like Secretary Mattis at the Department of Defense, like General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, like Secretary Tillerson, can do a lot to sort of close the gap between sometimes what the presidential rhetoric is and what's actually happening on the ground, they can only do so much, and they can only sort of, you know, shore up that foundation to a certain degree. So I too have some anxieties in terms of, and I think it is bleeding into, or I think you see it manifested perhaps in not having quite as much dynamism in Brussels around the United States and the traditional leadership role that we've had in the alliance, you know, where the US really often is energetic in setting the agendas for ministerials, setting the agendas for summits. And it's there, you know, where I wonder if we have the right amount of momentum for that kind of leadership role. And I think that's the challenge I see. So plenty of good continuity, but I would certainly prefer to see us treating Europe and talking about Europe like the partner that it has been for the United States for so many years. I think that's where I'd like us to be, and it doesn't feel to me that we're there right now.
Thank you. Let me just do a quick follow-up. Both the national security strategy and the national defense strategy took a tough line on Russia. Are there issues that we can work together on going forward?
Yes, but I think they're modest at the very best. I think we are really in a period of what I would call managed competition with Russia. I think anytime you have a large power with a very large military and a very large nuclear arsenal, in as complex a security environment as we find ourselves in today, you want to find a way to cooperate with that partner. You want to find, or to cooperate with that power. You want to find a way to try to diffuse tension as much as possible. But when you look at Russia's actions, you know, over the last 5 years, I think they speak for themselves. I think Putin wants to drive wedges into NATO wherever he can find them. I think he wants to reestablish his near abroad. And I think those goals are very much in conflict with the United States and NATO's goals for Europe, you know, peaceful and free. So I think, you know, we may be able to cooperate in modest ways around counterterrorism. Don't misunderstand. I don't think, frankly, that I don't mean cooperate in Syria when I say that. I think, you know, more narrowly. I think we can possibly continue to try to cooperate with Russia when it comes to counterproliferation and possibly counter-narcotics. But I think the broad tenor for the foreseeable future is managed competition. And that's why I think things like the intercept of the Russian fighter jet of our P-3 pilot coming within 5 feet of each other. I mean, this is like closer than the Blue Angels flies, is extremely dangerous. And it's that kind of behavior that we really need to call out and put a stop to in the broader context of such a flammable situation.
Great, thank you. Kristen, focusing on some economic issues. Historically, as you know, we've had very strong ties between the UK and Europe, the EU. What do you see as the greatest challenges facing the European economy going forward?
I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, the economy feels pretty healthy. There's economic growth is as jobs growth is as good as it's been in a decade. Business climate indicators are way up. Consumer confidence is good. So in the short term, it actually looks like a pretty positive time. Like Europe might be coming out of this lost decade, and that might give them room to sort of tackle some of the core long-term issues. But there are really serious challenges about how they do that, in part because of this growing Euroscepticism, the rise of populist groups. There's this kind of unhealthy feedback loop that a lot of what they need to do on the economic side is hard to do because of the kind of populist threat. But the only way they can address the populist threat is through stronger economic growth. And so just to give you an example, Europe needs flexible labor markets. They have, Europe combines countries with very high youth unemployment, particularly in Southern Europe, with countries that have aging populations like Germany and sometimes labor shortages. And that's why one of the principles of the single market is free movement of people, that you can move people across borders. But that's been a core issue in sort of driving some of the populist discontent with Europe. This was a principle in the abstract and still until the EU expanded to include Central and Eastern Europe, and then you actually started seeing people moving for economic reasons. And I think Europe may have, European institutions may have overplayed their hand a little bit. So the principle started out as an economic principle, kind of flexible labor markets, and they turned it into a principle in support of a European citizenry. So it's more about like kind of blurring national borders than it is just about economic growth. And people, including people in the UK, understandably reacted negatively to the idea that their national identity was suddenly illegitimate. And so anyway, there was this real tension between the kind of economic growth agenda and the European political agenda. This is going to obviously play out in the Brexit negotiations. I think whatever we think about sort of how the UK misplayed their hand in those, fundamentally, I think Prime Minister Cameron's agenda for the EU was a fair one. He basically said, we want the EU to be focused on the single market. We want the single market to be competitive. And I think the EU missed an opportunity actually to take the UK up on that. But we're now in this situation where politics in the UK won't allow them to do the kinds of things they need to do to maintain full access to the single market. That's going to hit their economy quite hard. I think the US has a clear, dog in that fight because we depend, for all the reasons Julie pointed out earlier, we depend on a healthy British economy to support investments in defense and to help support NATO. So I think this is going to hit us indirectly as well.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up. With this issue of Brexit and the Brexit narrative, part of that, and particularly after Trump was elected, was the idea of a free trade agreement between Britain and the US. Is this going anywhere?
I haven't heard anything about it recently. It's hard to imagine. I mean, the Brits don't have the kind of bandwidth to deal with it, and it feels like there's some capacity issues on our side as well. But I think it's actually worth considering. As a bilateral agreement, it's a pretty straightforward one. It's financial services and maybe autos. And the really ambitious and interesting way you could tackle it would be as a trilateral agreement. So it's basically a way of kind of revitalizing TTIP. So you put the EU at the table, the UK at the table, and the US. And it might actually help in their negotiations if the kind of US is one of the, right now they have kind of limited incentives to play nicely with each other, but actually if our market was on the table, maybe that would kind of help. So anyway, so I think this is worth keeping open as a discussion.
Great, thank you. Well, since we've got such a great audience, let's open it up. If you could just state your name and where you're from, and then a quick question. Come on, guys. Okay, right there.
Is there a mic or?
Do we have a mic?
Okay, I'll shout.
Okay.
My name is Erica, and I'm an international development consultant. And using the opportunity of all female panel, I wanted to take kind of a little of a twist and ask a question of whether you have seen and know of studies that were made about the impact of increasing women's leadership in the transatlantic relationship and security. Because we all know the trend is there. There are more and more women in the leadership making decisions in the transatlantic security, whether it's the heads of state, ministers of defense, and diplomats. So have you seen really valuable and solid data on that? Because I believe that this would really help us promote their current trend in the transatlantic community, but also help us push forward in other parts of the world the same gender equality issues.
Can I take a
Sure.
crack at this? Swing. So I haven't seen studies, necessarily specifically in the context of the transatlantic context. But I would say this, as some folks who work with me know, I'm not a big fan of sort of talking about women in peace and security for the sake of having women in peace and security. And I personally don't believe that having more women in leadership roles, having more women in the security community will necessarily lead to less conflict, less hawkish postures, less military intervention, et cetera. That said, I am a huge proponent of seeing more women in leadership roles, be it in the broad national security community or the specific transatlantic community, because I think there are lots of studies that show, and Harvard Business School is full of them, there are lots of studies that show that diversity in groups, that when you have diversity in teams, whether it's gender diversity or ethnic diversity or socioeconomic diversity, you get better outcomes. You have different people with different perspectives, bringing those different experiences to bear. You're able to look at issues from a multiplicity of different angles and come up sometimes with more and different options and solutions than you would have if you had a group of individuals who all looked the same, whether they were all white men or all, you name the most specialized minority group that you can think of. So I think there are studies out there that show the value of diversity of people and genders and so on in leadership roles. I don't know whether they're specific to the transatlantic context, but I think there's a great case to be made for why that's beneficial, and it's about outcomes, more than it is about gender diversity for gender diversity's sake. That's my view.
Would either of you like to comment as well?
Perfect.
She got it.
Yeah,
She nailed
perfect.
it.
Well done.
Okay. Please.
Well,
Ellen.
I will just speak loudly. My name is Ellen Scholl. I work here at the Atlantic Council and actually wanted to ask a question. Julie, this may be to you first, but for anyone on the state of the coalition negotiations in Germany, and in particular, if a grand coalition were to be formed, if we should expect anything new coming out of Germany, and whether or not that will have an impact on the transatlantic relationship, and then in particular, how to view the fact that refugee issues seem to be an ongoing stumbling block in forming a new government in Germany.
Well, on the German coalition, I mean, we seem to be finally marching towards the ever-famous Grand Coalition option that was not entirely clear a couple months ago after their election. At first, obviously, we thought we were headed towards some sort of minority government, a different coalition the Jamaica coalition. That fell through, so everyone's back at the drawing board, or they were by the end of last year. We just got through a vote with the SPD. We had to get the blessing of the SPD party to move forward with this concept. It seems like it was a nail biter, but we're marching towards a coalition agreement. Hopefully Germany will have this government in place in the coming weeks. This has been a remarkably long process for Germany, and I think most people will sigh a big breath of relief when it's all said and done. But when it is all said and done, there are a lot of open-ended questions about how this coalition wants to proceed on a number of issues. Refugees is one that's a sticking point with a variety of views on all sides, some looking for a very tough approach on the future of German refugee policy, others looking for kind of status quo with some modifications. But I think irrespective of what it actually ends up looking like on paper and all the rest, what we will likely see is a Merkel that is not in a position of strength. And that's not good news for the transatlantic relationship, and a series of partners across Europe and with Canada and the United States that are seeking strong, capable partners that have the will to take action. The hope was that Merkel would use her final tenure in a more innovative way, and she likes to, she's a little risk averse, we all know, and I think she's done a very good job. But she is one that has shown herself to be, she's very methodical. She wants to think it all through. She doesn't shoot from the hip. We'll see even more of the methodical decision making, consensus building, and that will lead us to a place where Germany, to the extent that it has been a leader, particularly on economic issues, may even take a step back. The real open-ended question is, what will this Franco-German, the ever-famous Franco-German engine look like going forward? Macron clearly has ambition. We've seen that in the Davos speech. We've seen that in the Sorbonne speech. There have been a number of occasions where he's laying out a very ambitious view of the future of Europe and where he wants to take Europe post-Brexit. But he needs Merkel's buy-in to do that. And the degree to which she can lean in or help shape that vision in a way that will address so many of the issues that we're discussing here today, particularly the concerns at home, on the economic front is an open-ended question. And so, you know, I'm relieved to see that we're going to settle on some sort of outcome and this won't go on forever. But I do fear that to the extent that many of us wanted to put an even greater leadership role on Merkel's shoulders and let her kind of carry the baton, frankly, while Washington is consumed with its own dysfunction, we may be disappointed in that regard going forward. I hope I'm wrong, but that's the sense right now.
Oops. More questions? Great.
Amanda Brown with Brownstein Hyatt. Christine, you mentioned the heavy emphasis on Russia in the NSD and the NSS, and it looks like we're starting to develop some smart policies on Russian interference in elections, and I'm curious from your perspective about more overt Russian interference, particularly about some troubling reports about Russian interference in Serbia and how that might destabilize the Balkans more generally.
Yeah, well, I think we have, a lot of work to do, frankly, on that front, both looking at Russian interference in elections, and I'm very pleased to see a number of new organizations have been formed to try to start helping us tackle that, because as of right now, coming out of the government, I don't see a lot of very explicit actions to try to address that problem. But in terms of countering, Russian active measures and things like Little Green Men, I think both the NSS and the National Defense Strategy signaled that this is going to be a major focus area for the foreign policy community here in the United States and for the Defense Department in particular. And some of that work, don't get me wrong, I think frankly we have a lot of work to do still. I think we were intellectually starting to come to grips with the problem when I was in the Department of Defense, but we hadn't yet done as much as needs to be done in terms of figuring out what are the tools, what kinds of thresholds should we be setting to make decisions about taking action. I think a big part of what is needed is going to be more intelligence collection capabilities, more senses of how do we know what are the right indications and warnings. And a lot of the capacity for that kind of thing had been very focused on the Middle East and Afghanistan and other places, because we didn't think we needed to have it in Europe, frankly. And so, but I think, I've only seen the unclassified version of the National Defense Strategy, and I'm told that the classified version is very comprehensive, is 10 times as long, and I think there's a lot of good grist for the mill and a lot of very specific guidance to the military services about what they need to be doing in terms of what kinds of capabilities, what kinds of new operational concepts we need to get after that.
Yeah, that's sure. Well, that's a great idea. Why don't we collect a few, please?
Agnia Grigas, Atlantic Council. I have a question of what is your view on how much appetite there is in Europe to continue sanctions on Russia, and how much commitment? Do you think that will start to falter at some point, or do you think this is an area where the U.S. can have the support of the European allies?
Great. Let's take two more.
Hi, my name is Christina Yotis. I'm a cybersecurity expert. I'd like you to comment a little bit on the General Data Protection Regulation and the Single Digital Market and how that's going to impact relationships in U.S. companies. The knowledge bank that we had at the FTC is pretty much gone, and those folks were the ones that were doing a lot of the negotiation for Privacy Shield. And right now, I don't see a lot, and we lost Chris Painter at State. We don't have that global cyber diplomacy channel. So if you can talk a little bit about what's happening, because the General Data Protection Regulation goes into effect in May, and it's really about commerce more than anything. It's certainly about privacy, but it's really about commerce.
Great. Let's take one more. There's in the back. Right there.
Hi, I'm Christina Tsafoulias with the Embassy of Switzerland and also with the Robert Bosch Foundation Alumni Association. Thank you all very much for being here. I had a question about sanctions too, but it related to North Korea actually, and bringing the transatlantic relationship to bear in a different context. So I've been reading a lot about, there are a number of folks out there really proponents of ratcheting up the sanctions regime against North Korea as one of the only viable options right now in terms of trying to disincentivize a nuclear buildup there. But it only really works if China and Russia are on board for this and other international partners. So to what extent do you judge a willingness among European partners to play ball on a massive increase in sanctions on North Korea? And do you think there's an opportunity there for the United States and the Europeans to sort of team up and apply pressure to Russia and China to do the same?
Who wants to take sanctions first?
Oh, I was just going to say on North Korea, I don't actually see a big evidence that the administration has a big transatlantic strategy on North Korea. I mean, when you talk to them about the how they're approaching it, they're sort of for the next stage of sanctions, they talk about U.S. unilateral sanctions on Chinese institutions. So that's kind of the next, the sort of next stage. And they've sanctioned some small Chinese institutions, but there's a debate internally about whether they go after one of the big ones. And then there's this debate about the preemptive military option and the so-called bloody nose strike. And it's really, it's surprising to me because it really looks like that option's getting a lot more consideration than you would have expected. There's been this message muddled between the sort of president's threat of fire and fury and Secretary Tillerson's comments about diplomatic approach. But when you talk privately with them, they say that they basically reassessed the U.S. assumptions about why North Korea wants the program to begin with. It had been conventional wisdom, basically when we were all in government, that the principal reason was regime preservation. And the Trump administration has said, no, that's not actually the fundamental reason. They want a weapon to use for coercion or blackmail, basically either to force reunification on North Korean terms or some other thing. And if you look at it that way, then the sort of trade-offs of a preemptive strike look different to me. So that's all to say that I actually don't see them looking at this the way I think we did with the six-party talks or the Obama administration did about how do we sort of develop this big coalition. It looks to me from the outside like they're taking this on a pretty kind of isolated unilateral basis. But
do you want to talk about Russian sanctions too?
Yeah.
Yeah, I will defer to you all much more as the sanctions people. I have plenty to say about North Korea and the wisdom of the bloody nose thing, but this is a transatlantic event, so I'll just zip it. Except to say that I'm very sorry to see that Victor Cha is not going to be our ambassador to South Korea. Yeah.
Just to echo what Kristen said, I think you're right. I'm not getting any sense that there's a big transatlantic plan on North Korea. Just as a side note, what has been interesting is I've been hearing a little bit about how much work has been going on between this administration and our European allies, particularly the EU, on what to do about Venezuela. And there's been a significant amount of really productive and effective cooperation. The EU just recently took a decision to move forward, as you saw, with some of the freezing of assets of members of the regime and their families and travel bans and all the rest. And that was done in very tight coordination with the current administration. And there's been quite a bit of praise on both sides with how they've been able to talk about Venezuela, what the plan could be going forward, how would you cope potentially with an oncoming humanitarian crisis that will no doubt continue to go from bad to worse. And there I feel the transatlantic heartbeat. I feel nothing and see nothing and have heard no evidence that we're in any sort of conversation. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm not asking the right people, but I don't see it on North Korea, not in the least. In terms of where we'll go forward on Russia, I mean, it's really by some small miracle that we've been able to hold on this long. I mean, there have been, as you know, countless predictions every time they're up for renewal that this is the end, we won't get the Italians across the finish line this time, and always one country or another. Germany's under pressure, German industry has had it. But, it's been ongoing, it's a challenge. I think Europe would very much like to see more in terms of America's Russia strategy writ large that would help them communicate to their publics what we're going to do together on the full package of challenges, from Ukraine to the anti-corruption measures inside Ukraine and dealing with Poroshenko, to our defense strategy, deterrence, reassurance. There's so many pieces to this. And while bits and pieces show very encouraging signs, I think a lot of Europeans are still claiming that they're missing kind of the big picture. Tillerson tried to outline some of that in his Woodrow Wilson speech late last fall in November. There were some tough lines in there about Russia, but you didn't get a sense that there's much of a plan. And I think that was in part because they've been lacking the staff at that, again, assistant secretary level, the DASs, the DASDs, the USDP at the Pentagon that would help move that forward. And now as some of those people settle into their seats, maybe we'll be able to carry this forward in a way that would allow us to talk about not just the sanctions piece of it, but over the next couple of years, where do we want to go in this relationship? What are the prospects for dialogue? How will we address NATO-Russia issues at the oncoming summit, which is still kind of an open-ended question. So I hope that as we continue to work on that together as partners, we can hold firm. I guess the last open-ended question is, if things really fall apart on Iran, and there's deep frustration and a real break in the transatlantic relationship on that front, how does that impact, or how will it impact other aspects of our relationship where we have come together? Is there a credibility and trust issue that will seep into other issues from that? I mean, we just don't know, but I hope, and again, so far we've been pretty good about this. I hope we can maintain our transatlantic unity on this, because it's the strongest card we have to play, truly.
Before someone answers the cyber, on this note, with the list that came out yesterday from the Treasury, could you try and translate the point of the list?
Well, sorry, go ahead. No, please.
Well, there are two, and we haven't seen the classified list, and that may have been full of. But the unclass version was basically, as someone in the Hill pointed out, was basically, copied of the, Forbes list of, wealthiest people in Russia. I think it was half the size, which was one disregarded the terms of CATSA, which said they wanted people who are not only wealthy but also tied to the regime. And I think that goes to Julie's point that the administration's just talking out of both sides of its mouth on Russia. On the one hand, we have a national defense strategy that, that really sort of focused on the risk of great power conflict, and then we have sort of on the practical side, looks like the administration really hesitating on some of the sort of congressionally driven Russia policies, and so it's really unclear kind of where do they want to take the Russia relationship. And I think there's a big I think it's going to be hard to hold on to Russia sanctions in Europe if we can, as Julie said, if we can't kind of spell out where we think they should head.
Great. And the cyber question.
I'm not a GDPR expert at all, but I will say it's clearly true that I think the U.S. has lost a step in terms of how it's going to advocate for those issues at the State Department. But I think one interesting thing I pick up from in our kind of Europe meetings is that the data issues are coming up in a different context, kind of not just about the transatlantic relationship and the digital trade, but about the competitiveness questions. So one thing that's different from when we were in government is that AI is all over, all everybody's thinking about is kind of how many industries are going to be driven by new data tools, including machine learning. And there are competitive countries are putting themselves, have different competitive advantages. The Chinese have massive, government investments in it. They have this close link between commercial and military uses. So they kind of they have a regulatory environment that, is very permissive in use of the data. They can go to scale without ever leaving the country. So, they have these smart cities where they're sort of testing algorithms, at scale. We have some big advantages in the U.S. too. We have these advanced, we have big tech firms that have advanced capabilities and a kind of fairly permissive regulatory environment. And so Europe has to think about, in the data world, sort of how does it compete in that? It has actually pretty restrictive regulatory environment, and hasn't made the kind of investments. And so what will that mean for European companies going forward? And when they think about kind of data privacy, the trade-off in the European debate has been between Facebook versus data privacy. And the data privacy proponents will say, we don't care if Facebook exists in Europe, so that's an easy trade-off. But it matters a lot to them if European car companies or European financial institutions or other firms can't compete in a kind of data-driven world. So to me, I'm all for data privacy, but you have to have a real debate about what the trade-offs are in some of these kind of regulatory questions.
Great. Did anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, let's take a couple more questions. Anne.
Speaking of Russia, what about Turkey? Turkey recently has created many headaches within NATO. I was just there within NATO. How do they still rest as a strategic partner, not only with NATO, but with the United States when we cannot possibly utilize them in any defense situation?
Let's take a couple more. Okay, right back there.
Hi, my name is Blake Vieira. I'm with the Enough Project, and I'd just like to know what you think of recent nationalist sentiments, especially in the government of Czech Republic and Poland, and how this may weaken NATO's frontier with Russia and potentially compromise the entire organization.
And then there was one right here.
I'm Adam Hunter. I'm an independent consultant and board member of Cultural Vistas. My question actually pairs nicely with these because I was going to ask transatlanticists about erosion of democracy. So to broaden these questions from before, thinking Turkey, thinking Czech Republic, thinking Hungary, Poland, and of course with the US administration that has stated that our foreign policy aims will be less tied to values as a bulwark to these norms, really from there on a spectrum to even outright support for some of these tendencies. What tools do we have in the transatlantic arsenal to kind of work against this erosion, as limited as they may be, and how do you view this trend affecting the transatlantic community's longer-term ability to be successful in and of itself and as actors on the world stage?
Who would like to?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I mean, there are many things that contribute to the strength of the transatlantic relationship: our defense cooperation, our economic and trade relationship, the institutions we've built together. But the values piece is to me one of the more critical pieces. And it sets us apart from other sets of relationships that the United States has around the world. No other two continents share the value set that we share with Europe. And what has worried me about this administration is the very light touch that they've given at all, if at all, in various speeches and strategies and doctrines to the values piece of the transatlantic relationship. Rule of law, democracy promotion, support for human rights, the list goes on. And that all comes at a dangerous time because not only are we trying, or is Europe trying to grapple with the formal exit of the United Kingdom from Europe, but it is simultaneously trying to cope with kind of an unofficial or informal pseudo-exit from at least some of the EU's core values. And that brings us to the countries that have been listed in these sets of questions of what's happening internally inside Turkey, what's happening, what just happened in the Czech Republic, trends we're seeing in Poland, rolling back the judiciary, oppressing civil society, purging civil servants. It takes many forms. But this is a very real challenge for Europe and for the United States and for the transatlantic relationship more broadly. The European Union is entertaining different types of taking action, whether you're looking at trying to rejigger voting rights, or if they should actually consider sanctions of some kind. All of that's very difficult because as an institution that operates largely under consensus, you can have a single country like Hungary issue a veto over something against their neighbor Poland. And so it's an open question how the European Union is going to grapple with this. But if it does not grapple with it or send a signal or at least a shot, however ineffective, across the bow, I think it says something to European publics and to their American partners about how they are handling and how weak they might be, what kind of position they're in to cope with these types of internal challenges. So it's going to be, I think, for all the visions, that have been outlined for Macron, and however Merkel may join him in, charting a new path forward for continental Europe, this will be at the heart of whatever they do, trying to grapple with these kind of, it's almost like a soft exit of some kind. They're not formally leaving any institution, but they seem to be leaving behind some of the core values. And Turkey, I don't know what the path forward is going to be with the Turks. I mean, there's so many things that are very troubling. Folks on the inside of NATO tell me that on a day-to-day basis, their perm rep is quite cooperative and things are going okay. But the decisions that Erdogan's taking at home and the recent decision to go into up against the Kurds in Syria, the decision to acquire the S-400s from Russia, and this very cozy relationship between Erdogan and Putin, that's all very disturbing. And that erodes those core values that sit at the foundation of the relationship.
Yeah, I would just say I'm particularly concerned about Turkey. I mean, I think it's sort of a ticking time bomb, and for all of the reasons that Julie just mentioned, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. I mean, when I was in the last administration, we were, you already sort of felt like you had, you're sort of the United States is in the middle, and you've got Turkey and you've got NATO over here, and you're trying to hold them together, and we're trying to navigate between Erdogan and the Kurds. But it's just gotten pulled farther and farther apart with Erdogan's decision to go into Afrin. And I certainly believe that there is extensive discussions going on behind the scenes through military channels saying, you do not want to get into a situation where you're going towards a Manbij and potentially endangering U.S. military personnel. So, my sense was when we were all in, a lot of the approach with Turkey was just to try to have lots and lots of contact, lots and lots of dialogue, lots of trying to reassure, lots of trying to find what were the risk mitigation strategies that might resonate with them. And I would just, I don't see another path besides that either, but I just would imagine that hopefully is intensifying at all levels and in all sort of areas, whether it's security or economic or democracy promotion. Because Turkey really is unique, I think, in many ways, given that it is in the center, or it's an important member of the NATO alliance, and yet is conducting itself in many ways that go directly against what the alliance stands for. I mean, in Poland and Czech Republic, there are issues there, but I think at least on the security side, I don't see them taking the kinds of steps that are nearly as concerning as what you see Turkey doing.
Great, thanks. A couple more questions. Right there.
Ladies, thank you for your comments. Very insightful. When we look at the recent discussions and pressure on defense spending, I'm Tim Hayden from Brookings. I'm a federal fellow there. Sorry. When we look at our NATO partners and defense spending as a function of GDP, typically U.S. 4%, Europe right around 2%. Are we myopic in our view by pressuring them to increase their defense spending and maybe not realizing those returns and other elements of national power? And any thoughts you have on that would be nice.
And right behind.
Hi, my name is Ashley Nellie Davis. And my question is more about bringing the transatlantic message home. So we talk about the importance of a value-based alliance, these partnerships, and how I don't know how it helps the world be a better place in a broad sense. But constituents are the ones who are voting in representatives and presidents, and so how can we take this message to those voters, to future generations of voters, not necessarily to decide for them what should be done with it, but that it is important and that there is a place for it, rather than just seeing it as something that DC talks about.
Julie, could you also talk about the Across the Pond initiative, which I think directly,
So yeah, we just recently launched a new program at CNIS called Across the Pond in the Field. Over the next 3 years, we're going to be going to 12 cities across the United States, taking 2 Europeans and 2 Americans to have conversations about the future of the transatlantic relationship. And we meet with business leaders, students, we do local media, we do big public events, and local, the mayor, whoever will see us in any of these cities. We've done 2 so far. We've been to Pittsburgh and the surrounding suburbs around Pittsburgh, and then we just got back from Salt Lake City. It is a challenge to get out there and talk about the transatlantic relationship. There are surprises. Utah in particular is incredibly internationally minded because of the LDS missions and the connectivity to other nations and cultures, folks that have spent years abroad, speak languages. So it's a really interesting dynamic and fascinating set of conversations that were very different from what we heard in Pittsburgh and the suburbs. But you pick up an array of things. You definitely encounter the kind of the Trump administration's line of Europe's not doing its fair share. So that comes up a lot. And to our European guests, why will you refuse to take on the burden of your own security? You know, where is the burden sharing? So a lot of hands go up on that. And a lot of mythology surrounding the refugee policy in Europe. Why did you, Germany or Sweden, we had the Swedish ambassador on one of our trips, decide to take so many refugees? Are you regretting that? It seems like you should be regretting it, is often kind of the hidden message from some of our guests that we encounter. There's some conspiracy theories out there you encounter along the way, but I would say about half of the people we encounter in the public events and one-on-one engagements do have some appreciation that the fundamental argument, we can't do everything alone. We can't solve things like North Korea or Russia or Syria or climate change if they consider that to be a challenge. Or something like Ebola by ourselves. And so you do succeed in having conversations with people about the value and utility of partners and allies. There's still open-ended questions about burden sharing and is the United States doing too much? But it's been an experiment. I mean, it's only 2 cities, so it's probably not fair to pass any judgments. We'll have to get out there and do all 12 and report back. I take your point, and that's one of the reasons why we started this program. I mean, I think all of us sitting here talking to each other is lovely. I could do it every day. I do it every day almost. But we also have to take time out to get a little bit out beyond Washington and do more to address this widening disconnect between Washington and the rest of the country. The only bit of really good news that we've encountered that others have seen out and about, I know Damon and Fred and other folks here at Atlantic Council have been out and about as well, is the immense hunger to have these debates. So even when we're completely at odds and finding people that disagree deeply with some of our assumptions and kind of pronouncements about the value of the transatlantic relationship, people are generally kind, they respect us, there's no food fights, no hecklers. I mean, huge crowds are turning up, 120 people at a small public library in the middle of nowhere. I mean, just people coming out of the woodwork to say, we want to have this conversation. And time again, thanking us for showing up. So again, I don't know kind of what we'll do with all of this at the end. We'll certainly be writing it all up. But thinking about how we message all of this to a wider audience I do think is really important.
Does someone want to talk about the 2%, 4%, the budget issues?
I'm happy to. You should jump in too. It's true that Europe does lots of things in the world that have an impact on the security environment, development assistance, trade agreement, and all those things. But NATO isn't a do good in the world alliance, it's a defense alliance. And it depends on kind of the full participation of every member of the alliance. So So to me, it's quite fair to say that what we're talking about with the 2% is actual defense spending. To me, the thing we need to do a better job is explaining publicly that 2% is the proxy for what we really care. You know, it was the sort of simple proxy we came up with for what we really care about, which is capabilities. And if they get to the 2%, and that's all on a bunch of sort of staff, you know, that all goes to basically personnel, we haven't made any improvements. And what we really want is sort of a, you know, a more capable alliance. But
I think that's exactly right. And I would only add, I think that the NATO defense planning process is its own, you know, Rube Goldberg machine. But I do think going forward, finding ways to have real conversations with allies about capabilities, specialization, you know, interoperability, sort of maybe having subgroups within the alliance that focus in particular areas. I mean, the challenge is, of course, you're asking nations to balance their national militaries with their alliance, you know, responsibilities. But even the United States, I would say, from having been in the Defense Department, both as a career person and as a political, you know, our military's viewpoint often is, yeah, NATO's great, and yes, we have fought with them, you know, in coalitions lots of times, but we can't count on them. We don't know, because it's a political decision, we're not 100% guaranteed they're going to be there, and so when we do our plans, we got to do it all by ourselves. And if they come in at the end, then great, that's, you know, gravy. And what that drives is a do everything, you know, plan to do everything yourself. And, you know, and it's not the most efficient way. So I'd like to see us, at least with some of our really close partners, you know, like the UK, like the French, like the Germans, maybe start pushing that envelope a little bit more. Because I think that could get us some efficiencies and some more bang for the buck. But there's a tension there, so I think that's real. I did want to just say one thing on the transatlantic values out into beyond the Beltway. I happened to be with a friend who's running for Congress in Michigan last night, and I asked her, you know, when you go, and she's deep in Trump country. Her district was, you know, voted for Trump overwhelmingly. And I said, you know, when you go out and go door to door and you talk to people, is anybody talking about the Russian elections? I mean, interference, you know, Russian interference in our elections. Anybody talking about climate change? Anybody talking about NATO? Nada. I mean, she said nada. You know, so my sense listening to her, and she elaborated a little bit more, is we need to find ways to connect NATO and transatlantic issues and the relationship with Europe to things that Americans really care about in their daily lives. Oops, sorry. You know, healthcare, clean water, job opportunities. You know, we need to explain how the transatlantic relationship helps them in those ways, because it sounds like, you know, and this is just one small district in Michigan, but it sounds like people are much more focused on their bread and butter than they are on the big transatlantic issues, which is a really important thing. So I thought that was interesting for what it's worth.
Let me ask a follow-up, not to get too in the weeds, but this new PESCO initiative in European defense. How do you think that that's going to roll out, and as it relates to this issue?
Julie, you want to take that one?
Sure. So yeah, well, this is the Europeans have been talking about developing a more effective, stronger security and defense policy inside the European Union for many decades, and when it was first mentioned in the late 1990s at the back end of the Clinton administration, I think America reacted quite negatively. You know, what does this mean for NATO? There's going to be two splits now, lots of duplication, not helpful. I think since then, since the late 90s, up all the way until 2018, through various US presidents, we've kind of come to recognize that if it's in fact easier or more helpful for some countries to develop more capacity and capabilities through the European Union than NATO, we could probably live with it, with some conditions put on it. Obviously, America's preference is always to work through the institution it's a member of. We don't belong to the European Union. So the preference is always to have all of this routed through NATO. But we've kind of shed, I mean, some of our schizophrenic messaging on this, although there are still some legitimate concerns. Now, recently, with this PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation announcement inside the European Union, we kind of went through it all over again. What do you mean? Are you building a European army? Oh my God, you know, you guys, you're going to spin your wheels on this and have nothing to show for it at the end. The thing that's changed with this is not only some of our own attitudes where we're concerned but not so anxious about it, but really what's changed is they're actually putting some real resources towards this. And so I think particularly in the area of R&D, we're going to see some real traction, not tomorrow, but in 5 to 10 years. I do think something real will come out of this. We now have a commission that's very active in the area of European defense in ways it hasn't been. It was largely given to an organization called the European Defense Agency. We now have both of those institutions kind of actively starting their engines again in some unique and interesting ways. So I don't want to be overly hopeful, but I think in certain capability gap areas, like EW is a real problem for European countries. I think they could develop those capabilities actually through the European Union, and then some of the more high-end stuff that we need them to focus on will be developed through the NATO defense planning process. The open-ended question is, how do you weave together the defense planning processes of both institutions so that they can complement each other and not leave a country, I mean, pick any country in Europe, say the Netherlands, saying, wait, the European Union's telling us to do X and NATO's telling us to do Y. We have a limited set of resources here. Where do we put our money up against our own national interests? So there's some open-ended questions, but I'm not in a panic about this. And if it actually produces a few added capabilities at the end of the day, I think that'll be a good thing for the transatlantic relationship.
Great, thanks. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Do we have any? Back there.
Hi, I'm Laura Coupe, and I work at the RAND Corporation. And I have a question about changing demographics. I feel like the US and much of Europe is changing, especially Western Europe is changing through migration, immigration. How can we have more frank discussions about how these demographic changes are impacting national identity, as well as ideals, as well as discussion around ideals of, you know, pluralism, diversity, et cetera, especially now in the face of the rise of populism in certain countries. So I was wondering if that's something that we should maybe start talking more about as the demographics of our countries on both sides of the Atlantic are changing.
I think it's a very challenging conversation, in part because our kind of views of perspectives on national identity can be very different. So it seems to me that one of the big advantages the U.S. has always had is that our identity is built around a kind of ethic, or you come to the U.S. and you're here for a generation, you start a company, and you're sort of as American as anybody else. That we're by definition a melting pot, nation of immigrants. And in parts of Europe, it's not true. Actually, the language, the attachment to language, the attachment to the sort of historic issues, you can be there for, your family can be there for generations, and if you're not, fluent in their national language and you don't have a name that sounds like it came from that country, you really, can be isolated. Now, I think the U.S. is losing, is at risk of losing that advantage. We're at risk of adopting that mindset, but it seems to me that what we really, it's very hard conversation in parts of Europe, that national identity can't be built on kind of an, ethnic identity, or that it has to be built around, a kind of ethic, a commitment, a patriotism, a commitment to, to be part of the country that you're joining. So.
Great. Okay, one more. Damon.
Oh no.
So I want to ask if the three of you could address advising the Trump administration. We have a president that came into office that hit a noise of sort of skepticism about Europe, both NATO and the EU. And yet you've seen the cabinet, the interagency, actually begin to develop a case statement for NATO, begin to develop policy lines for NATO. We're not really seeing that in the same way on the European Union. So how would you make the case to the President of the United States, as Mattis did on NATO, that it's in America's self-interest to have a strategy for and with the EU, and what does that agenda look like? Can you make that case in a way that could, how do you convince this administration that it's in their interest to move forward on the EU where we don't see as much real intentional work right now?
Sure. The case I make for the EU, is the one that Julie made earlier, that we build institutions together, that we share values, that we're interdependent. I don't think that most of that actually would carry weight with the president. I think the economic message could, that we have US companies that are enormously kind of dependent on decisions that happen in Brussels, that we have economies that, our economies are so closely linked that US growth is good for Europe and vice versa. So we need a kind of healthy growing economy. The defense related issues that we're dependent on a healthy economy actually to have them, be defense partners. So, I sort of think you could make a case along those lines. I think there are real challenges because we don't know, the Trump administration has shifted so much on their approach to trade. So when, at the inaugural address last year, the president talked about we need to protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, or stealing our jobs. But as his Davos speech last week, he said, we want a global trading system that rewards countries that play by the rules. Well, Europeans play by the rules. Like, that's a great case for, kind of favoring our trading relationship with Europe, for prioritizing that. So anyway, so my guess is I'd go out the Europe issues. It would help if they had someone in the job that Dick and I filled, so they need to come up with a nominee who can start to make that case.
Yeah, I would just say, if I had 5 seconds, that, this is a president, Donald Trump has really asked the NATO alliance to focus more heavily on counterterrorism. And what he probably isn't aware of is the fact that a lot of the best transatlantic CT work is done through EU-US channels on intel sharing, law enforcement, some of the counter-radicalization work we do. And so that's your ticket. If you can work CT issues through NATO, but they're bumping up against the limits of that right now as they press NATO to come up with more deliverables in that area for the July summit. And I think the EU-US relationship is an open door, and there's more good work to be done. We've done a lot since 9/11, but someone kind of taking the president aside to walk him through in 30 seconds why that CT relationship is just as valuable as our relationship inside NATO with our European allies might be one effective way in that gets you around the trade stuff. I mean, I do think you're right. I think it's evolving, and maybe someday we'll take a part of TTIP out of the deep freezer. But the security angle might be a good hook for this team. Might be more effective with the president. I don't know.
Well, thank you all.
I would just agree with that. I mean, I think that's, given his concern about foreign fighters, immigration, the threat of terrorism coming from Europe, coming from the refugees over here, certainly in my experience, the EU is where we really tried to make book on intel sharing and all of those issues, visa waiver issues and all of that.
Great. Well, this is terrific. I want to thank everybody for coming. I think evidenced by the amount of people here that this is an important issue. I want to thank the Atlantic Council as well, and Bina, Becca, and Ellen for driving this. I think we've just heard some amazing women, and I think we all feel better that they're here and they're talking and they're focusing and influencing the debate. I would just urge some of you in the audience who are going to be in Munich to look at the panels there, and that maybe you can help them diversify their panels because they are not diverse. So thank you all for coming.